Chinese president is setting an example when it comes to environmental protection by personally joining a tree planting in Beijing today.
In the decades after the mid-20th century, northern China's rapid development placed enormous strain on already fragile drylands.
But not only is this causing trade tension with the United States, it's also coming at a huge environmental cost.
As farms expanded and cities grew, wind erosion and soil loss accelerated, allowing deserts to press closer to towns and fields. What followed was not a single decision, but a long gamble to hold the land in place, one that begins where the soil first started to give way. When soil begins to fail. Northern China stretches across vast dry and semi-arid landscapes, where grasslands thin into scrub and scrub gives way to sand. These regions were never fragile by accident. For centuries, they balanced on narrow ecological margins, shaped by low rainfall, seasonal winds, and soils that recover slowly once disturbed. What changed was not the climate alone, but the pressure placed upon it. During the 20th century, farmland pushed outward to meet the needs of a growing population. Forests were cleared for fuel and construction. Grazing intensified beyond what grasslands could regenerate. Each decision seemed manageable in isolation, but together they weakened the land's natural defenses. Topsoil loosened, roots disappeared, and wind began to move freely across exposed ground. As soil dried and broke apart, dust storms became more frequent and more severe. Fine particles lifted into the air traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers, darkening skies over cities far from their source. Cropland lost nutrients faster than farmers could replace them. Rural communities faced declining harvests and fewer options for survival. This was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling. Desertification advanced unevenly, creeping forward in some areas while retreating in others. Its threat lay in persistence rather than speed. Once land crossed a certain threshold, recovery demanded time, resources, and coordination on a scale rarely attempted. By the late 1970s, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. The question was no longer whether the land was changing, but whether humans could intervene before the damage became irreversible. Planting against the wind. In 1978, China committed to an experiment measured not in years, but generations. The 3 North Shelter Forest Program emerged as a response to mounting environmental strain across the country's northern, northeastern, and northwestern regions. Its ambition was simple in theory and daunting in practice: slow the movement of deserts by reshaping the landscape itself. The plan unfolded across a vast arc of territory, stretching from Xinjiang to Heilongjiang. Instead of targeting one problem area, the program aimed to build layered defenses against wind erosion. Forest belts, shrubs, and grasslands would work together to reduce wind speed, trap soil, and protect farmland. The project was designed to evolve, with milestones extending toward the middle of the 21st century. This effort did not stand alone. It joined a broader national push to stabilize degraded land through multiple restoration initiatives. But the 3 North program became its most visible symbol, in part because of its scale and longevity. It represented a rare attempt to apply long-term ecological planning across diverse climates and ecosystems. At its core, the program acknowledged a difficult truth. Trees alone could not erase deserts. Success depended on matching species to soil, rainfall, and wind patterns, and accepting that progress would be uneven. What mattered was not instant transformation, but gradual resistance against forces that had already gained momentum. With policy in place, the challenge shifted from intention to execution. Turning maps into living barriers would require new techniques, local participation, and a willingness to adapt when early strategies failed. Engineering life into sand. Restoring land on this scale demanded more than planting trees and hoping they survived. Early efforts revealed hard limits. In arid zones, saplings failed without protection, and loose sand swallowed roots before they could anchor. Engineers and ecologists began experimenting, adapting methods to landscapes that resisted uniform solutions. One of the most effective techniques came from necessity rather than technology. Straw checkerboard barriers were laid across dunes in grid patterns, slowing wind at ground level and preventing sand from drifting. These simple structures trapped moisture and created pockets where grasses and shrubs could take hold. In some regions, aerial seeding supplemented ground planting, targeting areas too remote or unstable for heavy equipment. Shelter belts followed, arranged in long corridors designed to break wind speed before it reached farmland. Rather than dense forests, planners favored layered vegetation, combining trees, shrubs, and grasses. Over time, species selection became more precise, prioritizing native and drought-tolerant plants that demanded less water and maintenance. Human participation proved just as critical as technical design. Local communities were encouraged to protect restored land through incentive-based programs that tied ecological recovery to livelihoods. Farmers adjusted grazing patterns. Villages monitored planting sites. Restoration became a shared responsibility rather than a distant directive. Not every idea succeeded. Some experimental soil stabilization methods worked only in limited conditions and were abandoned elsewhere. These setbacks shaped later strategies, reinforcing a central lesson: the land could be guided, but never forced. Gains measured, limits exposed. Over time, parts of northern China began to change in measurable ways. Vegetation cover increased in several regions where wind once scoured bare ground. In some areas, stabilized soil reduced the frequency and intensity of dust storms, offering clearer skies and more predictable farming conditions. These gains did not arrive evenly, but where they held, the effects were tangible. The scale of change became apparent through satellite observation. A long-term analysis of NASA MODIS data revealed that China accounted for roughly a quarter of the planet's net increase in leaf area over 2 decades. This growth occurred despite China containing only a small share of the world's vegetated land, suggesting that large-scale restoration efforts had altered the landscape enough to register from space. Yet, progress carried limits. Tree survival remained uneven in the driest zones, where water scarcity constrained long-term growth. In some locations, monoculture planting introduced new ecological stress, increasing vulnerability to pests and disease. Restoration improved conditions, but it did not reset ecosystems to their original state. Dust storms still occurred, and some reclaimed areas required constant maintenance to remain stable. Success depended not on reaching a final endpoint, but on sustaining fragile gains. The land responded to care, but it also remembered strain. These mixed results forced a reassessment. The question shifted from whether restoration could work to how it could endure without creating new problems. Hands, policies, shared lessons. Behind every restored stretch of land were people whose lives were tied directly to its outcome. Farmers adjusted grazing schedules and protected young vegetation. Local officials balanced ecological targets with economic realities. These decisions shaped whether restoration survived beyond its first few seasons or quietly unraveled under daily pressure. Policy played a central role in aligning those interests. Incentive programs compensated households for protecting fragile land and reducing overuse. Long-term planning encouraged patience in a system often driven by short-term results. The work moved slowly, but it created feedback between science, governance, and lived experience. China's efforts did not unfold in isolation. As desertification intensified worldwide, researchers and policymakers exchanged knowledge through international forums and environmental agreements. China shared techniques, data, and lessons learned, while studying approaches from regions facing similar challenges, from Central Asia to Africa. No single model fit every landscape. Other countries explored advanced irrigation, soil-binding technologies, and adaptive land management tailored to local conditions. The common thread was humility. Large-scale restoration demanded adaptation rather than control. What emerged was not a blueprint, but a conversation. China's experience offered evidence that coordinated action mattered, while underscoring how easily progress could falter without local trust and ecological balance. Whether growth can endure. The Great Green Wall stands as proof that large-scale environmental recovery is possible, but it also reveals how fragile that recovery can be. Trees can slow wind and stabilize soil, yet they cannot survive without water, balance, and long-term care. Restoration succeeds only when it works with local ecosystems rather than against them. Future progress depends on adaptation. Species selection continues to evolve. Water management remains a defining constraint. In some areas, restoration may mean fewer trees and more grasslands, reflecting what the land can realistically sustain. The goal is no longer expansion, but resilience. The deeper lesson extends beyond China's borders. Desertification is not a problem that can be solved once and forgotten. It demands patience, restraint, and a willingness to revise strategies when conditions change. Human ambition must stay tethered to ecological limits. The question ahead is not whether deserts can be slowed. It is whether restoration can last long enough to matter in a world where pressure on land continues to grow. From orbit, so faint greens now thread across northern China, evidence that deliberate choices can still shape vast landscapes. But the work is unfinished. What happens next depends on attention, restraint, and memory, on whether societies choose to learn from fragile ground, rather than repeat the pressures that once set it drifting. If this story moved you, help it reach others. Like, share, and subscribe to follow more transformations shaping our planet's future.